Eleanor is 41. She has published 3 books of narrative nonfiction, each of which sold well enough to generate the next, and each of which required the same basic process. A period of research, the development of a structural argument, a production schedule she kept, a manuscript delivered on time and in the form the publisher expected. The process was not effortless, she would not describe it that way, but it was tractable. There were known inputs and known outputs. There was a method. She has not written a usable sentence in 14 months. She has tried working with a new deadline, imposed by a new contract. She has tried working without a deadline. She has changed her writing environment 4 times, her home office, a rented studio, 2 different cafes. She has worked with a writing coach who helped her develop a detailed outline for the new book, which sits in a document on her desktop with the structural coherence she intended and the complete inability to become sentences. She has tried writing the sections that interest her most. She has tried writing the sections that interest her least. Nothing works, and Eleanor has arrived at a conclusion that her writing coach would find professionally alarming. The block is not about writing. She does not yet know what it is about. She knows, with the intellectual precision that has characterized all 3 of her books, that whatever she has been doing, the trying, the deadlines, the environments, the coaches, the outlining, is not reaching the actual location of the problem. She is applying the right tools to the wrong level. She is correct. And the level she cannot reach by trying harder is the level Jung described, in a paper written in 1916 and revised 40 years later, as the most fundamental process available to the psyche when the ego's resources are exhausted. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The case presented is entirely fictional, constructed to illustrate a psychological concept. Jung wrote The Transcendent Function in 1916, during one of the most psychologically turbulent periods of his own life. The years following his break with Freud, a period he later described as a confrontation with the unconscious that nearly overwhelmed him. The paper was not published until 1958, when Jung revised it and released it. The gap between composition and publication is itself significant. He spent 4 decades living with the concept before deciding it was ready to share. For a writer, this is not an incidental detail. The transcendent function. The term requires immediate clarification because the word transcendent carries connotations in ordinary usage that Jung did not intend. He was not using transcendent to mean supernatural or elevated. He was using it in a technical sense, the function that transcends or moves beyond the opposition between 2 psychic positions. It is a third thing that neither of the 2 positions could have arrived at alone. The concept begins with the fundamental polarity that runs through all of Jung's psychology, the opposition between the conscious ego and the unconscious. The ego is the center of conscious life, the seat of intention, planning, reasoning, and the deliberate navigation of experience. The unconscious is not the opposite of the conscious in the sense of being inferior or irrational. It is the complementary totality. Everything the ego does not encompass, everything that operates beneath or beyond the range of intentional awareness, including capacities, images, and orientations that the conscious attitude has not yet been able to develop. In healthy psychological life, these 2 dimensions stand in a relationship of tension and dialogue. The ego acts. The unconscious responds with images, dreams, moods, and impulses that carry information from a perspective the ego does not have. The ego interprets. The unconscious offers what the ego's framework cannot generate. This dialogue is not automatic. It requires a specific orientation from the ego, not the orientation of control and production, but the orientation of attention and receptivity. When the ego's orientation is primarily one of control, when the psyche's mode of engaging with creative work is the same mode it uses to meet production schedules and hit contractual deadlines, the dialogue breaks down. Not because the unconscious withdraws. The unconscious does not withdraw. It continues to produce its images and impulses and oblique communications. But the ego, oriented toward production and measurable output, cannot receive them. They do not fit the format. They do not come in the form of sentences that contribute to an argument. They come in the form of dreams, moods, fragments of imagery, vague dissatisfactions, the restless sense that something is trying to surface that the current approach keeps pushing back down. In CW8, Jung wrote that the confrontation of the two positions generates a tension charged with energy. CW8, section 145. The transcendent function emerges from this tension, not from the resolution of it, not from the ego finally defeating the unconscious's resistance, but from a genuine encounter in which both positions are held simultaneously long enough for a third position to emerge that neither could have reached alone. To understand why Eleanor cannot write, it is necessary to understand what writing, her specific kind of writing, the narrative nonfiction that has been her professional identity for 15 years, has been asking of her psychology and what it can no longer ask of it in the same way. Eleanor's 3 successful books were produced by a method that drew primarily on the conscious, organizing dimension of her psychology, the capacity for research, structural argument, narrative architecture, and disciplined production. These are genuine intellectual capacities, and they produced genuine work. The method was not inauthentic, but it was one-sided, in the specific sense that Jung gave that word. It drew almost entirely on the ego's resources while treating the unconscious as a background condition, the source of vague inspiration that could be relied upon to provide sufficient material if Eleanor kept the structure and the deadline and the discipline in place. For 2 books, and arguably 3, this worked. The creative problem those books addressed had enough correspondence with the ego's agenda that the unconscious's contribution arrived without resistance. Eleanor was interested in her subjects. The interest generated sufficient unconscious investment in the project that the material came relatively willingly. What is happening now is different in kind. The book Eleanor is attempting to write, the one whose outline sits complete and inert on her desktop, is a project that the ego has constructed with perfect formal competence and that the unconscious has declined to inhabit. The structure is there. The argument is there. The research notes are there. And there is no life in it. Eleanor knows this with the precision of someone who has produced 3 living books and can tell the difference. The current project is not blocked at the level of execution. It is blocked at the level of investment. The unconscious has not shown up for it, and no amount of structural refinement or deadline pressure is going to change that. This is the clinical situation the transcendent function addresses. The ego has a project. The unconscious has, apparently, other ideas, or at minimum, a different orientation toward the project than the ego has imposed. The ego's response, in Eleanor's case as in most cases of creative block, is to increase the pressure, more structure, better deadlines, superior environments, professional coaching. These responses are all organized around the assumption that the problem is an execution problem, that what is needed is a better version of the same approach. Jung's framework suggests something fundamentally different, that the block itself is a communication, that the cessation of production is not a failure of the psyche but a message from it, specifically, a message that the ego's current approach has exhausted what it can generate from its own resources, and that what is needed is not a better version of the current approach, but a different kind of attention altogether. What the transcendent function requires is the suspension of the ego's agenda long enough to allow the unconscious to present what it has been holding, not the passive waiting that is sometimes called writer's block, the empty, anxious waiting in which the ego simply fails to produce while continuing to apply pressure from above. Active, attentive waiting. What Jung called active imagination, the practice of deliberately attending to what arises from the unconscious, in imagery, in dreams, in mood, in fantasy, in the unbidden associative materials that surface when the agenda is genuinely suspended, without immediately evaluating it for its usefulness to the project. This is the orientation shift the transcendent function requires, and it is a genuinely difficult one for people whose professional identity and self-regard are organized around production and measurable output. It requires the ego to stop trying to generate the solution and start attending to what the unconscious is offering. It requires the tolerance of what can feel from the inside, like passivity, the experience of not forcing, not producing, not controlling, which runs directly counter to the disposition that produced the first 3 books. von Franz, in her clinical discussions of active imagination, consistently emphasized that the ego's role in the transcendent function is not passive. It is actively receptive, which is a specific and demanding orientation. The ego attends, takes seriously, engages with what arrives rather than dismissing it as irrelevant or insufficient. This engagement is what allows the tension between the ego's position and the unconscious's contribution to generate the third thing. The new orientation, the unexpected angle, the image or insight or formal discovery that neither the ego's agenda nor the unconscious's material alone could have produced. In Eleanor's case, this might mean attending to the dreams she has been having for 14 months, the ones she has been dismissing as anxiety dreams rather than treating as communications. It might mean following the moods and resistances she has been working against rather than around them, asking what they are indicating rather than how to overcome them. It might mean sitting with the outline on the desktop not as a thing to execute, but as a question: what is missing from this? Not missing in the structural sense. The structure is complete, but missing in the sense of what is not yet present that would make the ego's project also the unconscious's project. That question has an answer. The unconscious has one, but the answer is not available through the current approach. It requires the approach to change first. Return to Eleanor. 14 months of block. A complete outline. 3 previous books that were alive. A current project that is structurally perfect and psychologically inert. The writing coach Eleanor worked with was skilled and well-intentioned. The coach helped Eleanor produce what is genuinely a well-designed structural framework for a book. What the coach could not do, what no coach can do, because it is not a coaching problem, is provide the unconscious investment that the structure is waiting for. The investment has to come from the psyche's deeper levels, and the psyche's deeper levels are not available through planning, outlining, or deadline management. What is the unconscious holding that the ego's book project does not include? This is not a rhetorical question. It has a specific answer in Eleanor's specific psychology, and that answer is available to her, not through the methods she has been using, but through attending to what has been surfacing in the 14 months of apparent absence. Eleanor has been having a recurring dream for approximately 8 of those 14 months, which she has mentioned to her therapist, but not examined in any depth because it does not seem directly relevant to the writing problem. In the dream, she is in a building she does not recognize, attempting to find a room she has been assigned. She cannot locate it. The building keeps rearranging its corridors. She is not frightened in the dream, only puzzled, and then increasingly certain that the room she is looking for is not on any map of the building she has been given. That dream is not about disorientation. It is about the gap between the map she has, the outline, the structural argument, the writer's method, and the room the unconscious is directing her toward. The room is in the building. It exists. She has not been given the right map to find it, because the map was produced by the ego alone. This does not mean the outline should be discarded. It means the outline is the ego's contribution to the transcendent function, necessary, genuinely valuable, but incomplete without the unconscious's corresponding contribution, which is not yet visible because Eleanor has not yet made the orientation shift that would allow it to become visible. The orientation shift, in practical terms, would involve treating the 14 months not as a period of failure, but as a period of unconscious production, of material accumulating in a form the ego has not yet learned to read. The dreams, the moods, the specific resistances, the moments of unexpected interest that did not fit the outline and were therefore set aside. All of this is the unconscious's offering. The transcendent function becomes available when the ego begins attending to this material with the same seriousness it has been applying to the structural argument. What the third position, the book that is neither the ego's outline nor the raw, unconscious material, would be is not predictable. That is, in Jung's framework, precisely the point. The transcendent function does not produce a planned outcome. It produces a third thing that could not have been planned, precisely because it arises from the conjunction of 2 positions that could not have been conjoined by planning alone. Eleanor's next book, if the transcendent function is allowed to operate, will be a different book from the one she has been trying to write. not necessarily different in subject or structure, but different in its relationship to the full dimensionality of her psychology. It will be a book that the outline did not contain and that the unconscious alone could not have produced. It will be a book that could not have been written until this block had done whatever it came to do. One might ask, as a genuine question about the projects and problems that have resisted the best applications of one's own method, whether any of that resistance has ever been treated as information rather than as an obstacle. Whether the thing that is not working has ever been attended to for what it is pointing at, rather than immediately addressed through a better version of the approach that is not working. This is not a call to abandon method or discipline. It is a question about the range of the method, about whether there are levels of a problem that the method was not designed to reach. One might also ask whether there is material, from dreams, from moods, from the unexpected interests that arise in the margins of organized work, that has been systematically set aside as irrelevant to the project at hand. In the framework of the transcendent function, that material is not irrelevant. It is the unconscious's contribution to the conjunction that the project requires. Its relevance may not be immediately legible in the terms the ego has defined. That illegibility is the indicator of its importance. The broader cultural implication of the transcendent function concept is this: the creative economy. The economy organized around the production of knowledge, analysis, narrative, design, and the various forms of intellectual and artistic work has, over the past several decades, developed an extraordinarily sophisticated set of tools for optimizing the ego's contribution to creative production. Project management systems, writing apps, creative coaching methodologies, productivity frameworks, AI-assisted drafting tools. All of these are, in Jung's terms, ego-level tools. They improve the efficiency with which the conscious, organizing dimension of the psyche does its part. None of them touch the unconscious's contribution. None of them address the question of what happens when the ego's resources are exhausted and the production stops. Not because the method needs refining, but because the method has reached the limit of what it can generate from the ego alone. The knowledge economy has no framework for the transcendent function, because the transcendent function is not a productivity tool and cannot be optimized. It is a natural process that requires a specific orientation, receptivity, tolerance of ambiguity, the willingness to attend to what arises without immediately evaluating it. That productivity culture systematically discourages. This means that the creative blocks experienced by intelligent, capable, methodologically sophisticated professionals are not simply efficiency problems. They are, at their depth, the signature of the transcendent function trying to initiate, the unconscious pressing against the ego's agenda with enough force to interrupt production, insisting that what the project requires is not a better version of the current approach, but a genuinely different kind of attention. The block is not the problem. The block is the beginning of the solution, if it is attended to rather than fought. Eleanor's 14 months of creative block is the longest and most productive conversation her psychology has initiated with her in 15 years of professional writing. She cannot hear it as a conversation, yet because the ego is still oriented toward production, still treating the block as a problem to be solved by better method. When the orientation shifts, when the 14 months are received as information rather than as failure, the transcendent function will have the conditions it requires. The book that emerges from that conjunction will be something she could not have planned. That is not a risk. That is the definition of genuine creative work. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The Shadow Work PDF, 5 Questions to Begin, is available through the link in the description. Subscribe if this series has opened something worth continuing. There is no shortage of Jungian territory to map, and the mapping does not accelerate with effort. It deepens with attention,